Sorry, thanks, Gloves. I suppose it's quite an honour to come off the bench. I thought I was coming on for Ross Davies, but I don't know Tim Mulholland, but he's got a good first name, so hopefully I can keep up with the namesake. Yeah, so I suppose a quick show of hands, who's watching news, social media, and just getting a little bit stressed, a little bit nervous, quietly shitting yourselves? I am as well. And I suppose I've spent a fair bit of time stitching up pig dogs on Saturday nights when the Wallabies are playing, and I'm not real keen to go back. But one of the things, as the cortisol level goes up, I think, well, what can I actually control in this environment? What can I control in the situation? And that's really the topic of my talk today, is in pertaining to foot and mouth disease, is really what is our circle of influence. So if anyone's familiar with the concept of circle of influence, I didn't make it up, it'd be a Stephen Covey thing probably, and the idea is that immediately around us we can influence on what happens in our day-to-day lives. The next barrier out beyond that is what we can, thanks Harry, what we can influence partially, but beyond that, the next barrier out is things we can't influence at all. And so how I see that happening in the sheep industry is that in the things we have direct control over, they're the things we can do on our farm. That's our biosecurity practices, having plans, our knowledge level, and our preparation. From that, we have some influence, and we have an ability to have some traceability, and we can influence that and influence the relationships we have with other people. And the third one, I suppose, is our limited control. And that's why I say, you know, what bullfeds do in Bali, Nepal, Thailand and Vietnam, I should learn how to speak Vietnam, apologies for anyone from Vietnam, is basically out of our control. And that's not something I think we should be worrying, spending too much of our energy on, because that's something our government's meant to do for us. So what's the current state of play? Living with foot and mouth disease. It's a risk that has been with us for a long time. Our risk has slightly increased with the incursion into Bali, but it hasn't been, in my mind, a drastic increase in our threat profile. You know, anyone who currently has a Bintang singlet, Singer, Lao beer singlet in your cupboard right now, you've probably been, I know there's some people in here who would be likely candidates for that. You've all been, India, another country, you've all been to countries that have had foot and mouth disease and are currently have foot and mouth disease as an endemic thing. So this graph here, the red indicates endemic foot and mouth disease. So that's the disease that is there full time. And of course we're in the green zone, which is great. And so now we're seeing incursions further south into Indonesia. But that's probably my first point, is that the threat matrix hasn't changed dramatically. It's just that now it's in an area that's a bit closer to home, and we do have a lot of Australians going there. But we've got a lot of Australians going to other places with foot and mouth disease as well. And so the challenge is that, well, I suppose the good thing is for foot and mouth disease to come into Australia, it actually has to jump a lot of barriers to get to us, to get to a farm. Conversely, lumpy skin disease is a disease that's spread by insects, a biting midge, and that's currently in Asia now, and that's probably one that's a really, for me, is probably more concerning, is because it's more likely to get here because we can't control under the entry points. We can't get an insect to put on its declaration. It's been on a farm in the last 14 days. So in the reality of it, that's the one that will really influence us some more. So I have had some experience with foot and mouth disease. This is me in the United Kingdom 2010, 2011. This is well after they had their outbreak. The secret to unhappiness is high expectations. I moved to the United Kingdom thinking they would give me some tweed, you know, a Land Rover, and I'd get James Herriot. They gave me a Peugeot 206, which is not really the boss car you're hoping for as a young veterinarian. I suppose how this influenced my mind is that biosecurity in the United Kingdom, we view it very differently to biosecurity in Australia. Certainly my first job out of uni was Canamble. You know, we'd wear the same overalls to job to job to job. Moved to the UK and I tried to pull that on, even with wet weather gear, and I was quickly reprimanded because these guys here had Olivia's quite a stunning farmer. But if you can't see that, that's one of those hairy cows, hairy coos, and trying a bit of Wild West foot trimming. But basically, biosecurity to them was ultra important, and certainly any dirt or that came on your boot, you would certainly your boss would be telling you about it by the time the complaint phone call went in. I was lucky enough to go to Nepal in 2018 with an Australian contingent looking at foot and mouth disease in that country. And you can see here on this picture, you know, this is the reason why so many of these Asian countries have an endemic foot and mouth disease problem, because they only own a handful of animals. It's a subsistence farming model, much harder to vaccinate, much harder to control. And you know, the irony is this lady owns that calf there with foot and mouth disease. She's smiling, because one of the, I suppose, the challenges with foot and mouth disease in a way is that it is not fatal to adult animals. So in a village situation, you might get some abortions, you might get some death of neonates, but you actually don't get a lot of death and destruction wholesale. For us, it's more of a trade disease, and the impact on trade is so significant, which is why it's such a major disease of trade. So, guys, when we look at, when I'm thinking about foot and mouth disease, I'm trying to think of, you know, I've got to know thy enemy. You know, I can control the level of disease knowledge preparedness I have on board. So basically, foot and mouth disease, it's very contagious. It causes fever and blisters and ulcers on typically the feet, mouth, nose and teats. It affects all cloven hoofed animals differently. So cattle, very characteristic, you can see it a mile away. However, sheep and goats, it's a subtle disease, and typically the biggest thing we see is lame sheep. Why this is so important is because it's so subtle, it's available to get through, particularly in marketplaces, very quickly and get around the place without, you know, really characteristic signs getting seen. This was particularly important in the UK outbreaks. It got around very, very quickly before anyone raised the alarm. So what's your incubation period? Incubation period is basically, and we know this from our COVID experience, is that's when we get an exposure to a disease and what we see in clinical signs. So that's the vesicles, the little blisters, the lameness. So that can be 1 to 14 days. So it's quite a long period, and it can certainly be in the animal for 4 days before they get it. Why is that important to us? Is that we need to be able to have good traceability systems, because we've got to work backly. By the time we get clinical signs, there's been a lot of movement going on, so we need to be able to get on the attack and work back very, very quickly. So how's it spread? Spread, of course, by animals. It can be spread by wind. Movement of, like, fomites is the fancy word, but basically trucks can do it. Contractors, feral animals, and Mexicans. I don't know if how many people use Canva. When you type farmer into your little thingo, a lot of these come up quite looking like Mexicans. I don't know why. I don't know if anyone's had that experience. So, out of that, what can we control? Out of this disease, what we can control. This is our circle. Our plan. First one, we can control our biosecurity to a large degree. We can control our preparedness, and we can control how we practice on farm, you know, with things like hygiene and our buying practices as well. So first off, biosecurity. Is it really that important? I look at biosecurity in 3 main ways. Basically, we're trying to prevent disease. We want to avoid the train wrecks. The second one is to detect disease, so that's market accountability. And the third one is to decrease disease treatment costs. So that can be the long term or the short term in terms of outbreak costs. So, now I might not be able to see it so well, but basically this is an example of a biosecurity plan. And the idea, the building blocks of this plan is basically to create barriers and reduce risk. That's the concept I go through in my mind. And so I've just got a little, easy one to do here. Do we introduce livestock? Do we put them in the period of quarantine? Again, that's a practice we can do. 21 days is recommended. So we saw before, when we look at incubation periods, so this is foot and mouth, but this is a whole heap of other diseases as well. We can put that into a practice on our farm, and that's something we can go forward and really kind of try to control something, give us some control over the situation. So that's a really easy one there. The next one is getting advice from experts and building relationships. That's something completely in our control in this situation. Do we have practices on board to prevent endemic diseases? So they're the diseases we currently have. Do we have that in place? Are we involved with our local veterinarian or government veterinarian on a disease level or on a yearly level even? And I think that's something as vets and as the sheep industry, I think there's a lot of uncoupling there, and I think at this stage we actually need to improve that. So this is a group of vets, all private vets, all getting together on Monday down at Bendigo Sheep Yards. We all recognise that going back to what's in our sphere of control, how well we're prepared, how well we communicate between each other. So we're all getting together, making sure we're polishing up on our skill sets. So the other thing about biosecurity is just not about foot and mouth disease. We want to look at how do we assess risk, how do we manage risk, and how we mitigate risk. And I suppose I always think about this and think, I own a Toyota. I'm familiar with some of the things that go wrong with a Toyota, but not everything that goes wrong with a Toyota. That's why I've got, Pete in at Dubbo, and he's part of my team because he's my mechanic. And I ask him about what do I need to do, put in a management plan, a maintenance plan to stop my car breaking down or to stop me blowing a tyre. And that's probably my comment here, is that biosecurity is all about getting expert help as well, because if you don't know what you don't know, how can you manage the risk of that? So I think that's really important for me, is get expert help to help you understand those risks. Because we've got the big five, Yonis, lice, foot rot, brucel and resistant worms. And this is something I've seen so much of in the last year with clients, is that when we've done trades and not understand the risk, then we end up with bigger problems than we expected. A great example is buying Western Australian sheep that have come through a Victorian sale yard. Huge risk, and I think people who don't understand that risk, it's easy to caught out. So if you don't know, you need to find out someone who does. So the question is, what risk? This is a general biosecurity comment. Sheep don't move that much at all, and they certainly don't move through the central west of New South Wales very much at all. As a biosecurity risk, I'll look through post-drought period in this part of the world and in all of Australia, is that, it's all bets are off. We actually have a lot of biosecurity risks, and this is something I saw in the United Kingdom, is the restocking after a foot and mouth outbreak causes so many massive diseases to come through, especially the endemic ones like Yonis, because there's so much movement. So I think the things we assumed about biosecurity pre-drought, I think are over now. I think we need higher levels of biosecurity because we've got so much higher movement of stock. So just to give you an idea, this is some foot and mouth disease modelling out of Victoria, and you can see there's so many movements of sheep and cattle. This is January 29, 2015. If anyone's looking to upskill their knowledge and understand how foot and mouth disease works, former CVO of Victoria, Charles Milne, he's a Scottish guy. He dealt with the outbreak in the UK, and he was one of the early ones to push for EID within Victoria. This is a great YouTube video, because it just shows you how quickly foot and mouth disease gets around and why it's so important to get on the attack early. So what else can we partially control? And that's, again, the speed of traceability. So that's good records, external, internal, and national EID. The other thing I think partially control is to have good discussions with your service providers, and there's agents in the room, vets. A lot of us are getting around, and I think this is a really good reminder for us as people who work and serve in the industry that we need to tighten up our belts as well. So speed of traceability it is essential for a foot and mouth disease outbreak. This is EID tags. Now this photo here, I took this photo on Monday in Bendigo sale yards. This animal has virulent foot rot, or I suspect it does. It's got a lot of underrunning right up there. And I suppose talking to the members of that sale yard, within minutes, because Victoria has compulsory EID, within minutes they can work out where this sheep came from, where it's been, and who the vendor was. And like I said before, minutes will be critical because we don't have much time for foot and mouth disease to go through. And the difference between an EID system and a mob-based system will be hours and days. And you can see here, hours or days will make a massive amount of difference to how far the disease will get, how fast we can respond to it, and how fast we'll get out of it. So to sum that up, there's three things we can do. We can control our controllables. We can control what happens on our farm. To do that, I think everyone needs to get a biosecurity plan. You need to prepare. You need to have your knowledge right and training. What can you partially control? Well, you can influence discussions on traceability within our systems and the relationships you have with your service providers. And of limited control, less social media, more biosecurity plans. So that's it. Thank you very much. There we go. All right. Questions?
Jim, you talked about the increase in risk, and I'm assuming it's the stats we're hearing, which has gone from 9% to about 11%. Right?
Yeah, correct.
That's an average. So that average spreads between 3% and 20% at the top end, which is at 20%. That's a 1 in 5 chance. That's a really high chance. Now, they've done more profiling on this to diminish that risk in terms of profiling of the potential person who might bring FMD into Australia, and that is a farmer going on holidays and coming back to their farm. Would you mind just commenting on that statistic? It doesn't sound like a large movement, but the top end has gone from 19 to 20.5%. So it's a relatively concerning number.
Yeah, certainly. I think two comments on that is that, when you think about risk management, a small percent risk with a catastrophic effect, regardless if it's if it's 7% or 9%, I agree, that is a significant risk. And a risk, you look at Challenger Space Shuttle, the risk of those seals breaking was quite small, but we saw a catastrophic outcome for that shuttle. I suppose the other one is, I think, outside of agriculture, where I think a lot of people should know better, and I think that we should have targeted campaigns on that area. I think for anyone who's not involved in agriculture, to get foot and mouth disease in Australia is quite small. I suppose the biggest one, how would I frame that? I think probably the biggest risk actually that posed for foot and mouth disease to Australia is not actually through people who are directly involved in agriculture. It is probably someone who would be a second generation Australian who's going back to their home. Maybe their parents immigrated from Vietnam after the war and they've gone back home and they're bringing the pork dumplings home, living in Western Sydney, having a few pigs or something like that and feeding swill. I think actually that represents the biggest risk to our trade. But I don't know how to manage that, and so I'm not sure I've answered the question. And I suppose that's why I look at it and go, the risk profile's there, but I can't control a lot of that things, but what can I control? So I haven't answered your question, but it's scary either way, I think, sorry.
Talk about now in the spot in Australia, how big an area will the stock movement be closed down?
My understanding is will be nationally.
Yeah. Well, look, this is something I just cannot understand. There's 23 million pigs in Australia, and I haven't heard anybody say anything about pigs. What's going to happen about that problem? You can't control them down. They talk about electronic tags. Nothing mentioned about pigs. You explain that.
Feral pigs, do you mean? Or?
Yeah, feral pigs.
I think my understanding is
And deer as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'll just be clear. My opinions are of a private veterinarian. I don't represent Team Australia, but my understanding is that the modelling, and whether you agree with it or not, the modelling suggests that pigs actually won't transmit the disease over large distances because the understanding is pigs don't interact as much as we might think. That's the modelling. But I think certainly your concerns about are pigs a vector that if it got into the pigs, we'd be in a lot of trouble, 100%. And
It's certainly going to make it a lot more difficult to clean it up too if there's in the pigs, isn't it?
100%, yeah, I would agree with that completely.
There's a lot more done about it.
That's a good comment. Anyone else? Hello? Oh, last question.
Talking about the fear of being quite silent, carrying on as well, or
I'm not as familiar with the clinical signs in deer, but I suspect that'd be similar to sheep. But to go back to the pig comment, one thing about pigs is that they are an amplifier host. So they make a lot more virus. So they're just a big virus factory, which is, I suppose, where you're coming from, is that pigs represent a significant risk because they shed disease and produce disease in such big numbers. But I'm not quite sure how deer fit into the kind of scale of that.
How will actual vaccine help us?
It will help us in the short term, in that what the idea of vaccinating is, it'll be ring vaccinating. So we'll vaccinate in areas around. There'll be a lot of modelling that would happen based on stock movements and wind. That's another big one. And it'll be just ring vaccinated around just to prevent, I suppose, a fire break. That's how we'll use it. To my understanding, Australia has a bank of foot and mouth vaccines currently in the UK. And the agreement is that the moment it's needed, it's put straight back on. Interesting enough, on a bit of trivia, Australia doesn't have any live foot and mouth disease, even in the Arle facility in Geelong, which is probably top 5 animal facilities in the world, because the risk is so great of it getting out. And certainly one of the UK outbreaks is coming out of a facility. So,
How far, you say the wind,
yeah.
how far we're looking?
Oh, great. I know it can go across from France to the Isle of Wight, but that's about as far. But so significant, yeah.
And just depending on the modelling, that vaccine, in some of the modelling, my understanding, all vaccinated sheep or cows are killed anyway.
Correct. It's not. It's yeah. Good question, David. It's the vaccination program is really about trying to create a fire break. Because the challenge with the vaccine also is that any animals that are vaccinated, my understanding is some of the proteins in the vaccine can still turn up in the blood test as foot and mouth, and they can't distinguish between foot and mouth disease from a vaccine and one that's a natural strain. So I think that happened in Taiwan. My understanding is they vaccinated a whole stack of pigs, but no one would let off the trade restrictions because they said, well, if you're vaccinating, we can't tell the difference, and so you must still have it.
And how long does that vaccine last? Is that like an annual thing, or is it a long term, like an only have to use it once with it, or whatever?
I think it's a fairly short-term arrangement, but I'm not 100% on that one. But.
Just a quick one about coming back to the traffic. You need to wash all your clothes and shoes and disinfect it or throw them out.
Yeah, great question. I think, I suppose when I went to Nepal, that we came back with the clothes on our backs, and certainly I think if you were going on farm to an endemic foot and mouth disease country, I think those joggers probably shouldn't come back. In terms of soaking your clothes, certainly coming back from Nepal, it was a 14-day quarantine from going on any farms, but I think all your clothes need to be soaked in citric acid. In citric acid, it's kind of like something you just add in and let it soak. But generally, if I was going on a farm tour to Nepal, Thailand, or somewhere like that, I'll just go to Vinnie's on my way over and wouldn't bring them any back.